The war room at Camp Lejeune was full. Every seat around the large tactical table was occupied. Officers of various ranks, captains, majors, colonels were gathered for a strategic briefing on operations in the Middle East. Maps covered the walls. Intelligence reports were spread across the table. This was serious business. Major Sarah Phantom Lion Mitchell entered the room quietly, a folder of classified documents under her arm. She was 37 years old, with dark hair pulled back in a tight regulation cut. Her dress uniform bore insignia that many people didn't immediately recognize. The rank of major was unmistakable, but her specialty badges marked her as something different from the regular infantry officers who dominated the room. She took a seat at the table, setting down her folder and settling in for the briefing. Around her, the other officers continued their conversations, mostly ignoring her presence. She was accustomed to this. She had learned over her career that entry into a room was often met with a kind of casual invisibility. The briefing officer, a full colonel named James Richardson, was going over tactical options for an operation in Afghanistan. He was discussing approach routes, defensive positions, supply chains. Everything was standard military briefing material. Then a major named Derek Thornton, sitting a few seats down from Sarah, asked a question about the operation's structure. "Who's running this operation?" Thornton asked. "Is this Army, Air Force, or are we actually putting Marines in charge of something?" The room laughed. It was the kind of laugh that comes from inter-service rivalry, the good-natured mocking that different branches of the military engaged in. Nothing serious, just the typical banter. Then Richardson answered. "Actually, we've got a Marine leading this one. Marine Major Sarah Mitchell will be the commanding officer for the tactical operations on the ground." Thornton's expression changed. He looked down the table toward where Sarah was sitting. His eyes clearly registered surprise, not the surprised respect that comes from learning something new about someone you respect, but the shocked surprise of someone who had just discovered something unexpected that he didn't immediately understand. Then he laughed, not a chuckle, a genuine laugh, the kind of laugh that suggested something absurd had just been said. "Sarah Mitchell," he said, still laughing. "The Marine major who leads the operation is a woman." The room went quiet. The laughter died. People realized that Thornton wasn't laughing at the inter-service joke anymore. He was laughing at something else. Sarah remained perfectly still. She had learned over her career that this was the moment when a choice mattered. She could respond with anger. She could respond with some cutting remark. She could respond in a way that made clear that she was offended. Or she could simply accept the moment and move on. "That's correct," Colonel Richardson said, his voice hardening slightly. "Major Mitchell is a highly decorated Marine with extensive combat experience. She's the best person for this operation." Right, Thornton said, but he was still smiling in a way that suggested he didn't quite believe it. "No offense intended, just surprised, you know." Sarah picked up her pen and made a note in the folder in front of her. She didn't look at Thornton. She didn't engage with the moment. She simply made a note and prepared to listen to the rest of the briefing. But inside, she felt the familiar weight of it. The moment when her competence and her authority were reduced to something surprising because she didn't fit the physical profile of what people expected. The briefing lasted another hour. Sarah listened carefully, asked technical questions, made notes about tactical options and potential complications. She demonstrated that she understood the operational parameters better than almost anyone else in the room. But the damage of that initial laugh had been done. Thornton kept glancing at her throughout the briefing, as if trying to reconcile what he was hearing, her intelligent questions, her tactical knowledge, with what he had expected to see, which was apparently a woman who was somehow unqualified. After the briefing was finished, as people were gathering their materials, Thornton approached Sarah. He was trying, she could tell, to be friendly, to undo the moment. "Hey, Major Mitchell," he said. "I apologize if I was out of line. I didn't mean to be disrespectful." Sarah looked at him. She could see that he genuinely didn't think he had done anything wrong. The laugh hadn't been intended as an insult. It had just been a reaction to something unexpected. "It's fine," Sarah said, because what else could she say? "So, how long have you been a major?" Thornton asked, the kind of question that was meant to be friendly but which somehow emphasized the fact that he didn't know her record. 9 years, Sarah said. "I made major 8 years ago." "And you've been doing tactical operations planning the whole time?" I've been doing a lot of things, Sarah said. Planning, commanding, training, advising, depends on the year. Thornton nodded, but Sarah could see that he still didn't quite understand why she was being given command of a significant operation. He was trying to be respectful now, but his fundamental assumption hadn't changed. She was still surprising to him. She was still unexpected. He walked away, and Sarah finished gathering her materials. She would lead the operation. She would do it well. And probably in 6 months or a year, when the operation was over and it had gone exactly as planned, people like Thornton would look back and realize that they had underestimated her. But in that moment, the damage was done. Sarah had been in the Marine Corps for 19 years. She had earned her rank through competence and dedication. She had served in combat. She had trained soldiers. She had made difficult decisions in dangerous situations. And yet, moments like the one in the war room still happened. Moments where her authority, her competence, her right to be in command were all questioned by a single laugh. When she had first entered the Marine Corps, such moments had devastated her. She had questioned herself. She had wondered if she really belonged. She had considered leaving, considering whether the constant battle to be respected was worth the career she loved. But she had learned, over the years, that the moments would keep coming. And she had learned that the only way to deal with them was to do her job so well that no one could question her competence, even if they questioned her presence. Her call sign, Phantom Lion, had come from a particular operation 5 years ago, one that was classified enough that most people didn't know the details. What they knew was that Sarah had led a small team into hostile territory. The operation had been extremely dangerous. The odds of success had been low. And Sarah's team had succeeded. They had accomplished the objective with no casualties, and they had done it in such a way that the hostile forces never even saw them coming. They had appeared and disappeared like ghosts, like lions hunting in the night. The call sign had stuck. It was whispered in certain circles. People who knew about the operation knew the reputation. But most people like Thornton didn't know the full story. They just knew the name and had vague ideas about what it meant. The operation that Sarah was about to lead required 3 weeks of preparation. She worked with her team, a group of 12 Marines who had been selected for their competence and their ability to work in high-stress situations. She knew all of them personally. She had trained several of them. She had recommended most of them for this assignment. The operation was to extract an intelligence asset from a location in northern Afghanistan. The asset was a person of significant value, someone who had information about terrorist operations that needed to be secured before the hostile forces realized he was no longer operational. The extraction was supposed to be quiet, in and out, no combat unless absolutely necessary. The location was in a built-up urban area which made things complicated. There would be civilians. There would be hostile forces trying to prevent the extraction. There would be limited options for supporting fire. Sarah spent hours studying the terrain. She looked at satellite imagery. She studied the movement patterns of hostile forces in the area. She calculated timing. She identified contingencies. She planned for everything that could go wrong. And she did all of this while maintaining her normal duties. She worked late into the night after her other responsibilities were finished. She came in early in the morning before the rest of the command was awake. One night she was in the planning room, alone, staring at a satellite image of the extraction zone. The room was quiet. It was nearly midnight, and the base had settled into the kind of silence that came in the early hours of the morning. A voice came from behind her. It was Colonel Richardson, the briefing officer. "You should be sleeping," Richardson said. Sarah turned. "I'm trying to understand the layout. There's something about the eastern approach that doesn't feel right." Richardson came around and looked at the satellite image. He was a good officer, experienced, respected, someone who had spent his career understanding military operations. "What doesn't feel right?" he asked. "The hostile forces will expect us to come from the north," Sarah said, pointing at the map. "That's the most direct route. The east side is more exposed, but the building has a secondary exit on the east side. What if we came from the east, made them think we were going in a different direction entirely?" Richardson studied the image. Sarah could see him thinking about it, working through the tactical implications. "That's a more complicated approach," he said finally. "Higher risk for your team." "But lower risk for the asset," Sarah said. "The hostile forces will be concentrated on the expected approach. The east side will be lightly defended. We can move in, get the asset, and get out before they realize what's happened. Richardson nodded slowly. Show me the rest of the plan. Sarah pulled up the contingency maps she had created. She showed him the escape routes. She showed him the support positions. She showed him the timing calculations that would allow the team to move in and out without being detected. This is excellent work, Richardson said when she was finished. How long did this take you? 48 hours of thinking, Sarah said, but I've been studying the location for 3 weeks. You should present this to the strategic planning team, Richardson said. Let them see the tactical evolution, show them how you arrived at this approach. Sarah felt something shift in her chest. She had been preparing this operation quietly, doing the work that no one saw. The idea of presenting it, of being seen doing the work, made her uncomfortable. I'm not really comfortable with presentations, she said. I know, Richardson said, but this work is good enough that it deserves to be seen, and I think people need to understand your process. They need to see that this approach isn't reckless, it's calculated, it's based on extensive analysis. Sarah nodded. She understood what Richardson was saying. He was suggesting that she take credit for her work, that she make it visible. The strategic planning team met 3 days later. Sarah was asked to present her tactical approach for the operation. She stood in front of the table with the same officers who had been at the original briefing, including Major Thornton. She walked them through her analysis. She showed them the satellite imagery. She explained her reasoning for the Eastern approach. She detailed the contingencies and the backup plans. She answered questions with precision and clarity. And as she spoke, she could see the room's assessment of her changing. What had been surprise at the beginning, surprise that a woman was leading the operation, was slowly becoming respect. These officers were beginning to understand that the operation was based on careful analysis, not on luck or on any factors other than competence. When she was finished, there was a pause. Then Colonel Richardson spoke. That is exactly the kind of tactical thinking we need, he said. Major Mitchell has identified an approach that maximizes the chance of success while minimizing risk to both her team and the asset. This is first-rate planning. The other officers nodded. Thornton was looking at Sarah with an expression that was different from the one he had worn in the initial briefing. Not quite apology, but something like recognition. Major Mitchell, one of the other colonels said, can you tell us about your previous experience with this kind of operation? Sarah paused. This was the moment where she could talk about her record, where she could make visible the competence that her reputation was based on. I've done 4 similar extractions, she said. 2 in Iraq, 2 in Afghanistan. All of them were successful with no casualties. I've also led training operations for 37 junior Marines in extraction and tactical infiltration, and I spent 2 years as the tactical advisor to the 2nd Marine Division. She stated the facts without emotion. She didn't embellish, she didn't make more of it than what it was, but the facts themselves were impressive. That's significant experience, the colonel said. The meeting ended shortly after. As the officers were gathering their materials, Thornton approached Sarah again. That was impressive work, he said. Seriously, I didn't understand the complexity of what you were doing, but that Eastern approach, that's clever. That's the kind of thinking that saves lives. Sarah accepted the compliment with a nod. She understood that Thornton had genuinely learned something. He had come in with assumptions about her competence and her authority, and those assumptions had been challenged by the evidence of her work. But she also understood that this was one man changing his mind. There would be others who came after him. There would always be others who saw her and made the same assumption. She couldn't spend her career proving herself to every person who questioned her authority based on her gender. So she did what she had learned to do. She did her job exceptionally well and trusted that the work would speak for itself. The operation was scheduled for 6 days later. Sarah's team was ready. Every contingency had been planned. Every person on the team understood their role. The equipment was prepared. The intelligence was current. The night before the operation, Sarah couldn't sleep. She spent the hours before dawn walking around the base, thinking through the plan one more time. She knew it was sound. She knew her team was capable. But the weight of command, the knowledge that people's lives depended on her decisions, was never something that became lighter with experience. At sunrise, she gathered her team. She went through the operation one final time. She answered questions. She made sure everyone understood their role. She made sure everyone was prepared for the contingencies. Then she looked at them. These 12 Marines who had volunteered for this mission, who had trained under her command, who trusted her leadership. "We're going to do this operation," she said, "and we're going to do it well. We're going to get in, secure the asset, and get out. And everyone here is going to come home. That's the mission. That's the goal. That's what we're accomplishing." The Marines nodded. They were ready. The operation went exactly as planned. Sarah's team moved into position. They approached from the east, just as she had calculated. The hostile forces were concentrated on the expected northern approach. By the time the hostile forces realized what was happening, Sarah's team had already secured the asset and was moving toward the extraction point. There was a moment of tension, a brief exchange of fire as one of the hostile teams discovered what was happening, but Sarah's team handled it with precision. They returned fire, maintained their position, and continued the extraction. 12 minutes after they reached the extraction point, the support helicopter arrived. The asset was loaded aboard. The team was loaded aboard. And they were gone. From the war room, Sarah's commanding officers watched it happen in real time. They watched the tactical map as Sarah's team moved through the city. They watched as the hostile forces tried to respond. They watched as the team successfully extracted. When the helicopter crossed back into friendly territory, a cheer went up in the war room. The operation had been a complete success. No casualties on Sarah's team. The asset was secure. The intelligence had been protected. And everyone in that war room understood at that moment that they had just witnessed the result of exceptional planning and exceptional leadership. When Sarah returned to Camp Lejeune 3 days later, something had changed. The operation had already been debriefed. The intelligence from the asset was already being processed. The tactical data from the operation was already being studied to improve future operations. But more importantly, Sarah's reputation had changed. The name Phantom Lion had always been a whisper in certain circles. People who knew about the classified operation 5 years ago knew the reputation. But most people didn't know the details. Most people didn't know the full context. Now, everyone in the Marine Corps knew that Phantom Lion had led a successful extraction operation in Afghanistan. Everyone knew that she had planned an approach that should have been impossible and had executed it flawlessly. Everyone knew that she had protected her team while securing a high-value asset. The name Phantom Lion began to carry weight. It began to mean something. In the war room, when officers met for subsequent briefings, the dynamic had changed. When Sarah spoke, people listened. When she offered an opinion, it was treated as the opinion of someone who had proven competence, not someone who was surprising because of her gender. Major Thornton, in particular, became one of her quieter supporters. He didn't make a big show of it. But when other officers made assumptions about Sarah's capabilities, Thornton would correct them. He would tell the story of the Eastern approach to the extraction zone. He would talk about how Sarah had identified a solution that the standard approach would have missed. And slowly, through the accumulation of these small moments, Sarah's position changed. She was no longer surprising. She was respected. But respect, Sarah had learned, came with its own complications. 6 months after the extraction operation, Sarah was promoted to colonel. It was a significant promotion, one that would put her in a position of greater authority and greater responsibility. It was also a promotion that she had earned through years of competent work. But when the announcement was made, some people saw it as something different. Some people saw it as political. Some people saw it as an example of the military becoming too focused on diversity and not focused enough on merit. Sarah knew, because she heard the conversations, that there were people who believed she had been promoted because she was a woman, not because she was the most qualified candidate for the position. It was the same argument she had heard at various points throughout her career. The argument that any success she had was suspect was somehow less legitimate than the success of male officers. And she had learned to live with it. She couldn't control what people believed. She could only do her job well enough that the evidence of her competence became impossible to deny. Part 5. The room goes silent. 2 years after the extraction operation, Colonel Sarah Mitchell was commanding a major Marine base. She had responsibility for approximately 4,000 Marines and significant resources. She was one of the most senior women in the Marine Corps. She was also, in certain circles, a legend. The story of Phantom Lion had grown. It had been told and retold. The details had been embellished in the way that military stories always are, the risks made slightly greater, the obstacles slightly more impossible, the success slightly more miraculous. But the core truth remained. Sarah Mitchell was someone who could accomplish what seemed impossible. She was someone who led Marines. She was someone who earned the loyalty of the people who served under her. One day, Sarah was called to a joint operations briefing. It was a high-level meeting with representatives from all the services: Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, Coast Guard. They were discussing a complex operation that would require coordination across multiple branches. The room was full of senior officers, generals and colonels, people who had spent decades in service, people who had reached the highest levels of their professions. Sarah sat at the table, reviewing the intelligence files. She was waiting for the briefing to begin when one of the Army generals, a three-star general named William Patterson, began talking to one of his staff officers. "So who's the Marine representing us?" Patterson asked, loud enough for Sarah to hear but not directly addressing her. One of Patterson's staff looked around the room and identified Sarah. "Colonel Sarah Mitchell," the staff officer said. Patterson looked at Sarah, and then he did something unexpected. He laughed. The same kind of laugh that Major Thornton had done years ago in the war room, the laugh of surprise, the laugh that suggested something unexpected had been said. "Sarah Mitchell," Patterson said, "the colonel who leads the operation is a woman." The room went quiet. Everyone had heard the laugh. Everyone understood what Patterson had done. He had done exactly what Thornton had done. He had been surprised that a woman held a significant military position. He had allowed that surprise to become a laugh. But this time, the response was different. Before Sarah could respond, a brigadier general named Marcus Shepard, someone Sarah had known for years, someone who had served with her in previous operations, spoke up. "General Patterson," Shepard said, "that's Colonel Phantom Lion." The room went absolutely silent. Everyone understood what Shepard had said. Phantom Lion, the name that had come to mean something in military circles, the name that was associated with impossible operations, with exceptional leadership, with the kind of competence that was rare and valuable. Patterson's expression changed. He realized in that moment what he had just done. He had laughed at someone whose reputation was known throughout the military. He had made an assumption about someone who had proven themselves to be extraordinary. I apologize, Colonel," Patterson said. "I didn't realize." But the apology wasn't really what mattered. What mattered was the silence that had filled the room when Shepard said those words. The silence that had come from the recognition of who Sarah was. The silence that acknowledged that underestimating her had been a mistake. The briefing proceeded. Sarah made her points about Marine involvement in the operation. She offered tactical assessments. She identified potential complications. And when she spoke, every single person in that room listened, not because they were being polite, but because they understood that when Phantom Lion spoke, it was worth hearing. After the briefing, Brigadier General Shepard found Sarah in the hallway. "Thank you for that," Sarah said. "I didn't do it for you," Shepard said. "I did it because Patterson needed to understand what it means to be in the presence of competence. He needed to understand that the name matters because the work matters, and I wanted to remind him of both." Sarah nodded. She understood what Shepard had done. He hadn't defended her honor. He had simply stated the truth about her reputation and let that truth do the work. That night, Sarah was alone in her office, reviewing reports and preparing for the next day's meetings. She thought about the moment in the briefing room. She thought about Patterson's laugh. She thought about the silence that had followed Shepard's words. She thought about what it meant to be known, to have a reputation that preceded you, to have a name that carried the weight of years of work and sacrifice and competence. When she had been promoted to major, years ago, she had thought that would be when the questions would stop, when she would finally be respected simply for her rank and her position. But she had learned that respect didn't come from rank. Respect came from work. It came from doing things well, over and over, in the face of skepticism and doubt. It came from refusing to let other people's assumptions define your capabilities. The laugh in the briefing room had been the same laugh that Major Thornton had given years ago. It was the same surprise. The same assumption that a woman in a position of authority was unusual, unexpected, surprising. But this time the laugh had been met with silence, not silence from anger or rebuke, but silence that came from the recognition of who Sarah was. And that silence was more powerful than any argument she could have made. 5 years later, Colonel Sarah Mitchell was promoted to Brigadier General. She was one of the most senior women in the Marine Corps. Her record was exceptional. Her reputation was undeniable. But what people remembered most wasn't her rank. It was her call sign. It was the name that had come to mean something in military culture. It was Phantom Lion. She had earned that name through an operation that most people didn't know the details of. But the name had become a symbol of what it meant to be an exceptional soldier. It meant you could accomplish what seemed impossible. It meant you could lead Marines. It meant you had earned respect through competence. Young Marines would talk about the story of Phantom Lion. They would tell the story to each other, the way soldiers always told stories about soldiers they respected. And the story would grow in the telling, the way military stories always did. But the core truth would remain the same. There was a woman who had earned a legendary reputation through years of quiet, exceptional work. She had been questioned. She had been doubted. She had been laughed at. And she had responded by continuing to do her job so well that the doubt became impossible to maintain. General Mitchell made it her mission to mentor the next generation of female Marines. She made sure they understood that their gender was not a limitation on their capabilities. She made sure they understood that they could be respected for their competence, not despite their gender, but simply because of their work. And when young female Marines would express doubt about whether they belonged, about whether they could make it in the Marine Corps, General Mitchell would tell them the truth. "It's hard," she would say. "People will doubt you. People will be surprised by your presence. People will make assumptions about your capabilities based on your gender. But you can't control what people think. You can only control what you do. And if you do your job well enough, if you're competent enough, if you work hard enough, eventually the doubt becomes irrelevant. Eventually, it becomes impossible for them to question who you are." She would pause, and then she would tell them about the briefing room, about the laugh, about the silence that had followed. "The silence," she would say, "is louder than any apology. The silence is when they realize they were wrong to doubt you, and that silence is worth everything you had to sacrifice to earn it." The room had gone silent when Shepard said those words, but it wasn't a silence of shame or defeat. It was a silence of recognition. It was the silence of people understanding that they were in the presence of someone extraordinary. And that silence had become the legacy of Phantom Lion, not the name itself, though the name carried weight, but the silence. The moment when doubt became recognition, when surprise became respect. That was the real power. That was the real accomplishment. It wasn't about winning an argument or proving someone wrong. It was about being so competent, so dedicated, so exceptional that people couldn't help but recognize it. And that General Catherine, Phantom Lion Mitchell understood was something that no one could ever take away from her. It was earned. It was real. It was based on the work itself. The laugh had been a moment, but the silence that had followed, the silence that had acknowledged her reputation, her competence, her extraordinary leadership, that silence was her legacy. And every female Marine who came after her would understand what that silence meant. They would understand that respect was earned through work. That competence was its own justification, that a woman could be extraordinary simply by being good at what she did. The silence in that briefing room had turned the entire trajectory of how people saw military leadership. It had shown, in a single moment, what it meant to be remembered not for being a woman in a male-dominated field, but simply for being one of the best soldiers anyone had ever known. And that, in the end, was everything.